At this time, I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Rhonda Barkus. Rhonda joined the National Rural Health Resource Center in 2012 and brings experience of over 25 years in hospital settings. She currently works as a project specialist with the Small Rural Hospital Transition Project. Originally, Rhonda worked on our Rural Hospital Performance Improvement Project and developed the Recommendation Adoption Progress, or RAP, reporting process, which focuses primarily on gathering and analyzing project outcome data. Rhonda is also an independent contractor with Northside Hospital in Atlanta, where she works with leadership teams to improve their effectiveness related to organization-wide goals. She has worked with organizational development and coordinated projects concerning HCAHPS, employee recruitment and retention, and staff and leadership development. She was previously in private practice and has experience with group, individual, and couples therapy. Now I will turn it over to Rhonda.
All right, thank you, Kim. I appreciate the introduction, and I have to tell you guys, I'm really excited to be talking about this today because this is just a topic I feel very passionate about. Before I started working actually in hospitals, well, actually prior to the work I did in medical hospitals, back in the mid-'80s, I worked at the State Mental Hospital in Georgia, which is located in Milledgeville. Worked there for a while, then eventually went to work at a private for-profit psychiatric hospital. And again, this was in the 80s when there was a lot of treatment still being done inpatient, and then eventually left and moved to Atlanta where I started working with Northside, working in addictions and as a psychotherapist, but then eventually moved over into organizational development and was working with the leadership teams. And so I've been working with HCAHPS actually since probably about 2004. And so I'm so excited to be talking about this today with you guys. Let me just go ahead and move down to the agenda. Okay. So just as a reminder, so the center where I also work, we work on improving healthcare in rural communities, and we specifically focus on those 5 core areas below, including performance improvement, collaboration and partnership, and then transition to value and population health, which really is a lot of what we're talking about today. So up here, as you guys are glancing through the webinar agenda, I want to point out a couple of things. I'll talk very briefly about HCAHPS, but I know that if you guys are on this call, you already are very, very familiar with it. And a couple other things, if you'll notice, I have one of the agenda items is using the 5 Ps. Some of your hospitals probably already do 4 Ps, 3 Ps, or something like that, and I'll describe some of this a little bit later. But I just want to point out that this item, as well as further down in the agenda, effective leadership rounds, I know a lot of you are probably already doing leadership rounds where you're going and talking to the patients about their experience, and you're already doing 4 Ps or 3 Ps or having your staff do those. If you're not, you'll be learning a little bit about those, but I just wanted to share with you that even if you see some items on here that you're already familiar with, what I'm really hoping to do is to share with you some of the small tweaks that over time, the work that I'm still doing with the hospital in Atlanta, we have found that some of these small tweaks are actually making all the difference in the world. And so I just wanted to share with you some of the things that we're finding. Now, I truly, truly believe that whether we are rural or urban, that while we might have different challenges, what the patients are looking for is the same, and that is they want to be treated with respect. They want to feel cared about. So some of the strategies I'll be talking about are actually from units that are anywhere from 20-bed units to 45-bed units, probably the same size as some of your hospitals. But on those units, in each specific culture of the unit, they actually worked on some of these strategies, tweaked them so that they could really impact the patient experience. So when I was working as a regular employee at Northside, I think it was probably early 2000s. I remember the CEO saying that he wanted to institutionalize customer service. And I thought that that was such an odd way to say that he wanted to have really good customer service in the hospital. But I think the point by using the word institutionalized is he wanted to make it something that was so much a part of the culture there that it was just the norm, and that was his goal. And I don't know about where you all are, but I will say that prior to that, the hospital I was working with, that was not always the case. And in fact, I remember when we first started teaching classes for nurses and techs around this idea of customer service, and we first introduced this concept, I remember folks sitting in the classes and saying, "You don't understand, I'm too busy to be nice." And I think that is one of the best things that's come out of really looking at HCAHPS is the realization that this is not about just being nice, but what we absolutely know that while what we do clinically for the patient matters, the medication, the tests, the treatments, that matters, we also know that the patient experience is going to impact their sense of healing. And if a patient feels safe, if they feel cared about, if they trust the folks who are taking care of them, then they are going to be more likely to do what they need to do and cooperate with us. They'll have less anxiety, which we know helps to decrease pain. And so we cannot separate this idea of the patient experience from the clinical things that we do for the patients. So it's really funny because now the younger nurses coming in, whenever they hear that that used to be the idea of, oh, I'm too busy to be nice, folks they look at me so oddly like, oh my gosh, how could somebody even say that? But I think that was the mindset in some places before. So when we rolled out, so we started rolling out and really looking at patient experience in the mid-2000s at this hospital, mainly in preparation because everybody knew that HCAHPS was coming and that it was going to be publicly reported information later. And so this slide just describes a little bit about HCAHPS and, again, things that I know you all are very, very familiar with. This is a kind of a timeline of the evolution of the HCAHPS survey. I think it's a little important to realize where we've come from. So in 2002 was when CMS and AHRQ started developing and testing the survey items. So if we think about that, it's been about 16 years that we've really been looking at this. October 2006 was when CMS implemented HCAHPS. The first publicly reported data went out March 2008, and I don't know about you guys, but I do remember when we first started having to publicly report data, it was terrifying. And I remember the units I was working with, many of them had satisfaction scores in the 30th percentile, 40th percentile, and I remember even the belief that we could even get to the 75th percentile felt overwhelming and so huge. And but over time, as we've really worked on things that make a difference, we have seen the outcomes change. 2013, CMS added the 5 questions concerning transition to post-hospital care, admission through the ED, and then mental and emotional health. And then I'm sure you all know that January 2018, so just last month, 3 new questions came out, and some questions were changed that involved pain management. And really it's an attempt to make sure that we're asking the right kind of questions so that we are not somehow encouraging the opiate addiction. And so the questions are just asked about pain in a very different way. All right, so that is the reminder about where we've come with HCAHPS. Now, why I think it is so hard for a lot of us to really sustain and change the scores. You all know that our responses and our scores are compared to other similar facilities and their scores. And so, you know, we might have, I don't know, 17 out of 20 responses that say that they give us a 10, but if we have those 3 8s, that's really going to impact how we might be comparing to other hospitals across the country. And so you guys know that from month to month and quarter to quarter, the scoring is always a moving target, depending on how others are doing in comparison to how we're doing. And so Rate the Hospital, as you all know, the only score that actually counts is a score of a 9 or 10. And so today, as I talk about some of these strategies and tweaking some strategies maybe you already have, I'm really going to be approaching this from the idea of how do we move the 7s and 8s to a 9 or 10? Because I think if we're getting scores of like a 2 or a 3 or 4 consistently, that's a different topic. That's a different kind of webinar probably. But this is really about when we're already doing okay, but we're right there on the edge, but we can't seem to kind of push it over. What are some strategies that might help with that? So that's what we'll be talking about. So this is not about remedial HCAHPS. And then, of course, the other challenge with the scoring is that only the always responses count. So again, in that same line of thinking, let's start looking at our scores of usually, see how many usuallys we got, and if we got, if we had 75% always, but then we had a lot of usuallys, that's the thing that's really impacting our score in comparison to everybody else. And so we need to really look at, okay, how can we move this usually to always? And usually moving the 7 and 8s to 9 and 10s or the usuallys to an always involves something around consistency and excellence. You know, whenever the units I work with, whenever we are seeing the scores start to slip, when we start looking at them and we look at our 8s or we look at our usuallys, what we are finding is that while 90% of the staff might be doing an amazing job, those other 10% are the ones that are maybe pushing it to a usually. Or even the staff who do an amazing job 80% of the time, 20% of the time they're doing a usually job. So those are the ones we really have to focus on. And so, of course, as we are all making improvements, so are the other hospitals. That's why we have to always be looking for ways to fine-tune what we're doing and make sure that it really is sticking. So I want to talk a little bit about what we are finding or what I'm seeing just from experience that is working. So when I was working in organizational development, my job was special projects coordinator. And so I was coordinating projects that had to do with the two main goals of the hospital, and that was HCAHPS or patient experience and staff retention. Those were the two main goals for the hospital. We knew that those two really go together because we know that when we retain the best of our staff, that's going to impact the patient experience. When we have really great patient experiences and those folks are really engaged, that impacts retention. So we know that those two go hand in hand. So for this hospital, what we did actually is we used, if any of you are familiar with Franklin Covey's model of the 4 disciplines of execution, and this again was back in the late, about 2007. So we used this model of let's pick 2 or 3 strategies that we think are going to make all the difference in the world. And let's figure out if we did these 2 strategies with excellence and consistency, and every staff was being held accountable to them, we believe that these would make a difference for the patient experience. So I'm going to talk about those 2 or 3 strategies. The other thing that I think was most important from that model, from Franklin Covey's model, is a couple things. One is we meet every week and we still look at HCAHPS scores every week, and we look at rounding and we look at staff rounding, and we're constantly looking at what's going well. So we stay on top of this. But the other thing that was so important is I think that the idea of line of sight, which means the folks in the C-suite, yes, they might lead the charge for better patient experience, but we know the ones that actually impact patient experience in the long run are the frontline staff, the ones that are day in and day out in the rooms with the patients, and that includes our environmental services and our dietary. So we really need to be including frontline staff in this. And Kim had mentioned, and Kim worked with me, and we created 3 podcasts. And as we go through and I talk about different pieces of these concepts, we'll let you know which ones will have podcasts. But we knew that it's one thing for you guys to come to a webinar and hear some new ideas or some tweaks on old ideas. But we also know that then it has to be driven down to the staff who are actually going to do this. And so we created podcasts that you guys could actually use in staff meetings or staff could listen to just on their own that will talk about how to do some of the very things that I'm about to talk about. The third bullet there, I think that's one of the things too that we began focusing on is that we really had to focus on creating a healing experience for the patient. It couldn't be about the things that we're doing to the patient. We get so caught up sometimes on the tasks that we're doing to the patient. It needs to be about creating a healing experience for that patient. And then of course we need to include accountability for staff and recognition. So there is a saying that I heard somewhere, and I have always been so intrigued by this saying, and that is that change happens when we do the right things for the wrong reasons. I don't know who said it, I don't know where it came from, but I always thought that was so fascinating. And the point of this saying is that, unfortunately, very often we do the right things, but instead of doing it just because it's the right thing to do, we do it for other reasons. So, for instance, patient experience, that's the right thing to do. That's the right thing to do with our patients, and that's how we'd want to be treated. However, realistically, a lot of us pay a lot of attention to it because it's going to lead to reimbursement or it's going to impact our hospital, our reputation. So I think that sometimes a real major change, usually it's a monetary reason that we change most things in this country, when instead of just saying, hey, this is the right thing to do, a lot of times we don't really change it until it's impacting the bottom line. So regardless of that, though, I think that what we are doing with creating that patient experience is the right thing, whether we just have to make sure that we are doing it for the right reason. And I'll talk a little bit about how to really focus on that, especially with staff. There is a video clip I often use in leadership trainings, and I have it up here. I'm not going to show it today, but I encourage you to take a look at like the first 4 or 5 minutes of this clip. And whether you love or you hate Nick Saban with Alabama, nobody can, I think, argue that he is successful. And this video clip is an interview from 60 Minutes done several years ago. And the first 4 or 5 minutes I often show to leadership teams, and sometimes even in staff meetings, because the piece that I want to point out here is he talks about what he calls the process, which is his way of coaching. And he says, ignore the scoreboard. Just focus on doing your job at the highest level every single play, and the wins will follow. And I think when it comes to HCAHPS, we have to keep that same thing in mind. Yes, we have to care about the scores. Yes, we have to post our scores, share them with the staff. That is important because it reflects what's going on. But I think what we need to do is to go back to focusing on we're doing this for the right reasons, and if we do it at the highest level, every single interaction with our patient, the scores will follow. You know, even in meetings, especially with staff, when we start getting too focused on the scores, try to come back to, guys, let's remember why we're doing this. Because we can't really change the scores. The only thing we can change is the way we are treating the patient and let that impact the scores. And I hope that makes some sense. So I encourage you to watch that. And again, though, it's about excellence and consistency, which is about what Saban's process is really about. All right, so when, let's see, so at the Atlanta Hospital, we started doing the 4 Ps, which I'll mention in a moment, and teaching those to the staff back in 2007. And then, of course, 2008 is when the HCAHPS data was publicly reported. We found that while doing different strategies was impacting the patient experience to some extent, actually what we really were missing is this concept right here. And I will tell you that this concept, as simple as it is, that when staff really, really get it, it makes all the difference in the world. I think more than any new strategy we roll out, this makes a difference. And so this is one of the podcasts, I think it's like 12, 13 minutes that we have that's geared towards explaining this concept to staff. I'm not going to go into as much detail as I do in the podcast, but I want to give you the overview of this. The idea is 3 things we have to do: intention, connection, and then action. Now, let me start with action. Action means whatever it is we're doing to the patient, giving them medicines, taking their vitals, helping them to the restroom, talking to them about their discharge. That is the action. Unfortunately, in our busyness, we get so focused on the action that we forget intention and connection. And so I teach this concept to leadership and to staff to remind them that before we knock on the patient's door, before we walk in the room, we first have to get crystal clear on what is my intention. Unfortunately, a lot of times for staff, the intention is I'm going in with the intention of giving this medication. I'm going in with the intention of doing these vital signs. The intention cannot be the action. I am a firm believer that every person who works with patients, whether it's, again, techs, nurses, environmental services, leaders that are going in doing their rounding, dietary, respiratory, every single person should have the exact same intention, and I think there's only one intention. And the one intention we should all have every single time with every single patient encounter should be, I'm going in there to do what I can do to help this person with their healing. So I'll say that again. I'm going in there to do what I can do to help this person with their healing. And if we can get staff, and if we can institutionalize that and get staff to and all of us to have that at a gut level, that I am going in to help them with their healing, I think what we need to do with the patient experience follows. And it's a lot more intuitive then. So it's not about I'm going to go in and do this because it's going to impact HCAHPS scores. No, it's because I'm going in to help this person with their healing. And then I walk into the room and I connect with the patient. And when I teach this concept, I spend probably a lot of time talking about this because it seems so basic, but it is not always an easy thing to do for everybody. Some people are wonderful at connecting. So when I teach this, I ask staff, how do you connect with the patient? And they talk about things like, I sit down in a chair next to the bed. I make eye contact with them. I smile. I ask them how their night was. I notice what they're watching on television, and I say, oh, I love that show too, or, oh, who's winning that game? The important part of connection is that I'm not connecting with that person as a patient. I'm connecting with them as a person. And I ask staff, if you have a good connection with your patient at the beginning of your shift, how is that going to impact the rest of your shift? And they will say, hands down, that the patient, the shift goes better, the rapport is better, the patients are more relaxed, they trust them, they hit the call light when they really need something, but they don't hit the call light just because they don't trust them not to come otherwise, and it makes all the difference in the world. Now, I know, and I acknowledge to staff too, there are some staff that are great at connecting. This is not sitting down and having a 30-minute conversation. A good connection can happen in 30 seconds. There are other people who are not good at connecting, and I tell those staff, you might not be great at connecting, but you know what? You got to work at it. It's not okay anymore just to say, well, this is just my face. This is how I am. I've always been told that I have this face, and it's just the way I am. No. If it's not your strength or your skill, just like anything else, you got to work at it. Maybe somebody else has to work on some piece of their clinical skills. Well, you've got to work on your connection skill. So we need to stop saying, oh, well, that staff member's just that way. They've been here 20 years and they're always going to be that way. It's something that folks can work on. So it's intention, connection, and then action. Then I go ahead and do the vital signs. Do the assessment, whatever it is I'm going to do. But it is important to do it in this order. I worked with a tech one time, and she got this concept. She said when she goes into a patient's room to help them with their bath, she said, my intention is not to go in and give them a bath. My intention is to go in and do what I can do to help them to feel physically and emotionally better. And we all know that when you get your hair washed when it's nasty, and when you have a bath and you have fresh sheets on the bed and a new gown, how much better you feel, right? So she said her goal, her intention is to go in and create that kind of healing for the patient. And by the way, she gives them a bath. Those are folks that get it. And so again, that is on a podcast if you are interested in knowing more about that concept. So I've mentioned a couple times 5 Ps. When we started doing these, we just used 4 Ps, those first 4, pain, potty, positioning, and personal needs. What we knew was that before we started doing this in our hospital, staff tended to be very reactive. When a patient needed water, the staff would go get water. When the patient needed help to the restroom, they'd help them to the restroom. When they needed another blanket, they'd give them another blanket. So it was very reactive. It was one task at a time. It was not good for the staff because they were running around like crazy, reacting to one need at a time. And so we said, hey, let's give this a shot. And so we rolled out this idea of these first 4 Ps. And the thing is, we know that the things that patients most often ask for are those first 4 things. We know that when they hit a call light, that's usually what they're requesting. And so instead of just waiting for the patient to ask, let's go ahead and proactively offer this while we're in the room. So we can do it all at once and not have to run in and out reacting to every little thing. I had a nurse one time who said when she goes into a patient's room, she thinks of every patient as if it was an isolation room. She said, when I go into an isolation room, I make sure that I have what I need to go in there. I make sure when I'm in there, I'm taking care of all the patient's needs at once. And she knows it's because she doesn't want to have to gown up in and out. And because that's a lot of time and a frustration and a hassle. And so she said she tries to think of the 4 Ps as that same way. Let me go ahead and do all of this at once. When we first started doing this, staff would complain and say, oh, I don't have time to do this. I'll be in everybody's room for 30 minutes. And what they realized once they did it with consistency and excellence is that it ended up saving time in the long run. So we stopped looking at, and many of you probably have stopped doing this too, we stopped looking at how long it took when a patient called for something, how long it took us to get to the patient. Because what we really wanted to do was to change that mindset for staff that ideally the patient doesn't even have to ask because we're proactively doing these things while we're in the room. And so instead of looking at the time it takes to meet a request, we started looking at how many call lights, how many folks are calling. And we're looking at call lights and we're saying, oh, well, this patient keeps asking for the same thing. Well, let's talk to this nurse and tech and see what's going on. Are they not proactively doing some of these things to help this patient out? Or do we need to talk about another plan for the patient? The other thing is if we see that certain nurses or techs, their patients rarely call for things, we know they're probably doing the 4 Ps. If we see certain nurses and techs who patients are frequently calling for things, we know they're not. So that's a piece, again, that we can share with them as we're looking at accountability, to be able to say, look at this. You know, this is the average calls that we get. This is what your patients are getting. What can we do about this? So doing these things proactively. Again, this is another podcast that is available for staff on how to do the 5 Ps, and it goes into a more detail certainly than I did here. Let me show you a little bit different, the language. So when we were doing the 4 Ps, the things staff would always say, actually prior to the 4 Ps, the staff before they left the room would say to the patient, is there anything else I can do for you? The patient would say no. 10 minutes later, the patient would get a call that the patient needed to go to the bathroom. The staff would get a call that the patient needed to go to the bathroom. And they'd say, oh, I was just in there. Why didn't they say something when I was there? So that's when we did the 4 Ps. So then we found that staff would be in the room and they would say to the patient, do you have to use the restroom? The patient would say, nope. But then what happens in 15 minutes? The patient calls, oh, you know what, I think I would like to go to the bathroom. And so that's when we started doing what we call proactive potty. So we, instead of just saying, hey, do you have to use the bathroom, we started creating kind of some language, and we don't script this for staff at all. So this is not where staff have to say this as a script. But here are a couple examples of some ways that staff actually use that proactive language. So instead of saying, do you need to use the restroom, they're going to say it a little bit differently, so it's more of a suggestion. Let me go ahead and help you to the restroom while I'm here. And if at all possible, go ahead and tie it to something they're doing for that patient. I'm about to give that pain medication to you. It's going to make you sleepy. How about if I help you to the restroom first, so that you won't have to get back up and get out of bed and get to the bathroom? Or I know that you're used to getting up on your own, but you're also connected to a lot of IVs. You're on some new medication. Let me help you to the restroom while I'm in here so that I can make sure that you're safe. So again, the language is slightly different. This is an example, I think, of a tweak where instead of just saying, do you have to use the restroom, they call in 15 minutes, we're busy with something else, we don't get to them in time, then they have an accident in the bed, and then we have angry patients. Let's go ahead while we're in there and use some of this proactive language. And I'm certainly can share more wording, just as suggestions, if you guys would want that too at some point. But all of this is part of the podcast. So two things. Remember, I was talking about Franklin Covey's idea that you just pick 2 or 3 strategies and do with excellence. So the 2 or 3 strategies that we ask staff to do with excellence and consistency is the 5 Ps and looking for opportunities to do moments of kindness. I will tell you that more than anything else, the moment of kindnesses probably are the things that have changed that patient experience from an 8 or everything's fine to, wow, oh my gosh, people here are amazing. So moments of kindness are things that staff do just on the spur of the moment, but they're encouraged to look for these opportunities to do something very kind for a patient that, or their family, or the patient's family, that shows that we care and we see them as individuals. Usually it's a small gesture. I'll show you a couple examples in a moment, but it's things where we do something for somebody. It's very personal according to them, so we have to get to know and connect with our patient first to find out a little bit about them. And then we do something where they go, oh my gosh, that was so nice. And we've all had those experiences where maybe we have not been feeling well, we're having a bad day, maybe a coworker or somebody does a moment of kindness for us, and we're like, thank you, this was exactly what I needed at this moment. So a couple things about moments of kindness: they are not service recovery. So this is not when we've already messed something up and a patient's mad and now we're going to try to go fix it. This is just spontaneously because we want to be kind. And it's not normal activities that any patient would expect. So sometimes staff will say, oh yeah, I went and I was in there doing something and I found out Mr. Smith likes football, and so we talked about football. Okay, well that's good, but we expect staff to talk about, to get to know their patients a little bit. So this is taking that a little, an extra step. So I want to show you some examples. This is something that a staff member created. She found out that the patient had a son who was in the military. And so the staff member found this on the internet, this military mother's prayer. This woman was pretty devout, so she knew it was okay to do this. And she just created little cutouts that she put on construction paper and gave it to the patients, or to that patient, and said, just thank you so much for what you're doing and allowing your son to be over there for us. Then the staff member signed it. Sometimes they will get other staff members to sign it. But again, imagine being the patient in the bed who is in the midst of everything else going on, for that patient to really be seen as a person with things going on in their lives and to be appreciated for that. So again, that's kind of like, wow, that was really nice, and it's not big stuff. Here's another one where a staff member found out that the patient was in the hospital and their child was about to have their first birthday. They just created this cute little flyer that said, we know that you're really anticipating that child's first birthday, and we're thank you for letting us take care of you, and we want you to get home as quickly as you can to your baby. And then the staff, again, signed it, or some wrote a few personal notes to that patient. Another one, this tends to be a theme. One of the things which is not a hard thing to do, but usually is a very, very significant moment of kindness, is when you have a patient who is also in the military or has served in the military. They will, sometimes the staff will just find, if the person was in the Navy, they'll find the insignia of the Navy, they'll print that out, say thank you for your service, handwrite it, doesn't have to be fancy. Staff will sign it. They will sometimes even put it up in the patient's room. And then every time that the doctor or dietary or anybody else comes in, they can see that and they go, oh, you're in the Navy, oh, my son's in the Navy, or in the Navy, and then they have something to talk about and they have a connection. And then that staff member will go over and sign the same document saying thank you for your service. So again, simple but really significant, and I'll tell you that these things impact not only the patient, but it impacts the staff, because most staff will say, I did not go into nursing to give medications. I went into nursing to feel like I was making a difference. And when they give something like this to a patient and the patient gets tears in their eyes, they know that they've made a difference. And there's so many, let me go back for a second. There's so many just significant things. I remember there was a man who was going to be sent, he was going to hospice the next day, and his wife was staying with him in the room that night. And the tech went in and he said, is there anything that you all usually do every evening together before you go to bed? They said, we usually have ice cream together. This tech went out and found a way to get somebody to get some ice cream to that patient and his wife, brought it in and said, here you go, you guys need to have ice cream together tonight. So again, this is the stuff that really opens up, I think, the staff members about the true purpose behind what we're doing with HCAHPS. So a nurse came up with this idea. So some of the patient rooms have this, and this is, it doesn't have to be anything fancy at all, but they have something that called the All About Me boards in the patient rooms. And the staff, whoever admits that patient, and when the patient's feeling up to talking about it, they'll go ahead and just ask them this information and put it down. What do want to be called. I mean, isn't that nice to think about connecting to somebody based on what they want to be called instead of calling them Mrs. Smith when she wants to be called Shirley? Where she's from, what makes her feel calm and relaxed, her favorite show, movie, music, what she enjoys, whether the person is hearing, vision, or speech impaired, and whether they use a cane or anything like that for assistance. So again, staff will use this. They walk in and they will see the person's All About Me board and they'll say, oh, you're from New York. Really? My mom lives in New York. And they have that connection right there. I've heard staff who do not work with that patient day in and day out say that they really like this kind of thing too, because when they're walking into the patient's room for the first time, they don't know anything about them. And so when they look at the All About Me board gives them something quickly to be able to connect with that patient around. I will say that if, it's so important, if we have something like this in a patient's room, staff have got to fill it out. This is one of the things we hold staff accountable to, because if we have an All About Me board in the room and it's empty and nobody ever asks that patient any of these questions, what is that going to say to the patient? Yeah, we say we care about you, but it's not really all about you because we aren't even asking you. So moments of kindness, again, so this is one of the ways staff figure out how to do moments of kindness. I heard an example this morning. I was in an HCAHPS meeting and somebody was talking about a tech, and at the hospital there, the staff are not allowed to have their personal cell phones on or use them while they're at work because certainly don't want them to be distracted, so they're not allowed to use them at all until they are on a break. And the tech said that she had been in the patient's room and found out the patient loved Bruno Mars. And again, I just heard this one this morning. So the staff member was talking about, oh, did you see the Grammys? And they were talking about Bruno Mars. So the tech came and said to her supervisor, I know I'm not supposed to have my cell phone, but I have a bunch of Bruno Mars music on my cell phone. When I go in to do that patient's bath later, is it okay if I take my cell phone and play some Bruno Mars while I'm giving the bath? And I heard later that the patient and the staff member were singing during the bath. See, that is about creating healing for that patient. Other really easy, simple things to do. Sometimes leaders have gone to Michael's or some craft store and bought these like larger smooth rocks that just fit in the palm of your hand. They're kind of smooth, and then they'll have some Sharpies, and then they'll encourage staff to write a word on the rock and give it to their patient if they feel that the patient needs something like strength or courage, and so the staff will just write courage on that rock and give that to that patient to hold on to. Had a staff member who's really crafty, and so she brought a bunch of pipe cleaners in, and she makes flowers out of pipe cleaners and hangs them from the patient IV holders, stands. Some of the units have created a little area they call Kindness Corner, where they just collect a bunch of little things that staff could go in and look at and say, oh, I could use that, or I could create something out of this, just to give them some idea for moments of kindness. Another really big one is just some really pretty blank cards where maybe a patient's had a really bad day and a staff member can just write a note saying, I know this was a really rough day. You got some really difficult news. I hope you're able to get some rest tonight, and just know that I'm thinking about you. So again, those are just some examples. And if you get staff together and start brainstorming, they can come up with some great ideas. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about staff accountability. Again, this is a podcast, and this podcast actually would be for supervisors or leadership, not for staff. But it talks about how to close the loop on accountability and use this coaching model that I'm going to describe. But when I'm teaching leadership, we often talk about this idea of a three-legged stool, that in order to get something to stick on the floor or the unit, on the floor, I don't mean like gum. Anyway, on the med-surg floor in the unit, the three things have to happen. First, we have to have clear expectations for staff. So we have to be able to say, this is a requirement, this is encouraged, this is what we're asking you to do, but we have to be clear. If it's required, staff need to know this is required. So the first, the staff has clear expectations of whatever it is they're supposed to be doing around that patient and that patient care. Then we have to, of course, provide education and training to make sure that they're competent, that they are getting their confidence, they know how to do it, they're able to do it. The third piece of that stool, and a lot of us do the first two really well. We set the expectations, we give them the education and training, and then we say, go do it. And then we check back in 4 weeks and we find out nobody's doing it. We're like, what happened? A lot of times it's because we're not doing that third leg of the stool. And the third leg is the hardest part, but this is the part where leaders have got to hold staff accountable and provide consequences. And I'm not talking about punishment. I'm talking about coaching to help them to get better. And I'm talking about real live recognition in the moment when they are doing it well. So it needs to absolutely be just as much about what people are doing well as what they could work on. I learned a model actually from Press Ganey, and a consultant working with Press Ganey, and she taught us this coaching model. And the coaching model is, you would use it as, say you are setting expectations for the staff member to go in and connect with the patient and do the 4 Ps, and so they come out, and so this is just a way to have a conversation with a staff member to talk about how that interaction went. And so there are 3 questions. The first question, you ask the staff member, what went well just now? Or, what do you feel proud about as far as that interaction just now with Mr. Smith? When we started doing this with staff, they looked like, what do you mean, what did I do well? So we really had to say, I really want to know. You were just in the room with Mr. Smith. I heard a lot of really nice things that you were doing. Tell me what you feel good about. So it's a way to get staff to really self-reflect, because they're so used to getting feedback, but it's a way to put the onus on them to start reflecting on, what did I do well? And so you would have a conversation with them about what went well, get them to talk about what they feel good about, and then the leader would say, yeah, and this is what I thought that you did really well. So it's a nice way to create this culture of finding good, not just fault. The second question, and again, there's a podcast on this in a lot more detail, is the next one is there anything you would do different? And so I'm not a big believer in scripting things where it has to be said exactly that way, but this question almost has to be said this way. Because if you change one word, it changes the meaning. If I say, what did you do wrong, then again, that says something very different. Is there anything you would do differently? That implies that they might have done everything well. And they could say, no, I feel really good about that. And you can say, great, I agree. That was fabulous. Thank you so much. I know your patient really appreciated you. So I think it does need to be said in this way so that it's very neutral. And again, I see a lot of supervisors changing the wording and saying, is there anything that, or what would you do differently? Again, that implies they did something wrong. But this is just a way to open a conversation on how they did. And is there, in retrospect, was there something that they forgot to do or they would do differently? If there was something really obvious and they don't say it to you, then you could just say this next question. So tell me how you could have made a personal connection with that patient while you were in the room. So this is when you're asking them, instead of saying, hey, you didn't make a personal connection, or hey, you didn't ask them about pain, instead you would phrase it a little differently. Tell me how you could go ahead and address that patient's pain while you're in the room. Again, this coaching model is about moving the staff and helping them to get better and better at all of this with patient experience in a way that feels supportive of what they're already doing well, but it's about incremental growth and working on one thing at a time to get better at it. And then the last question is, how can I help you with whatever that was? So if, for instance, say you were coaching that person on how to connect with that patient, then you could say, so how can I help you get better at that? Do you want to role play, how to have how to say, how to have small talk with the patient? Do you want me to, how about if I listen to you with another patient? You can and see how that goes. Maybe let's talk about how you might connect with that patient the next time you go in. So this is where you offer your help. So it's important that when you're asking this question, the staff realize that you're asking them how you can help them to get better at whatever it is you coach them on. Sometimes staff or supervisors will say, so how can I help you? And the staff say, oh, well, you go give my medications for me. And that's not what we're asking. We're talking more about how to help them get better at what they're doing. So again, podcast is available on that. So then a little bit on leadership rounds. I know that a lot of you do leadership rounds, and so these are just a few thoughts on tweaking that. I think it's just as important for the leader walking into the room to connect with that patient, to get clear. My intention is going in to create healing for that patient. That needs to be the focus. It's not about improving my HCAHPS scores. Yes, that is an outcome of creating healing for my patient. I'm going in to create healing for my patient and go in, connect with the patient, sit down next to the bed, maybe ask the patient, okay, if I visit with you for a few minutes, I'd like to hear how your stay with us has been. I will never forget the first time my brother-in-law was in on an oncology unit. This was a few years ago, and I was working with HCAHPS and all of this, so I knew what was going on. But the manager walked in. She had on a business suit. She had a clipboard in her arms. She walked in. She stood at the door, did not even come over near my brother-in-law, stood at the door and said, oh, hi, I'm the manager, and we like to do rounds and see how things are going. I just want to know if everything's going okay. And then we're like, yeah, everything's fine. Okay, thank you. Let us know if you need anything. Very ineffective use of rounds. This is an example of when it's a task instead of it really having an intention. So Kim had mentioned that one of the things that I do with the Small Rural Hospital Transition Project is I work with the hospitals after their project's been implemented, and we talk about the outcomes and how things are going. And one of the things I often hear CEOs say when I do my interviews with them, they'll talk about if they're looking at HCAHPS, and they will say, and this quote at the top, that they said everything was fine. I hear CEOs say that all the time, that I don't understand what's going on. I do rounds, the patient said everything's fine, but we get these surveys back, and that's not what we're hearing. I want to remind you that a fine is an 8. And remember, an 8 does not count. So when I say to the patient, how's your stay? Tell me about your stay. And they say, oh, everything's been fine. That should be a red flag to me. A fine is an 8. That is not, oh my gosh, this is an amazing place. You have the most incredible staff, which is a 10. So if you are doing rounding, should be a red flag that you need to dig a little bit deeper. And if they say, oh, everything's great, and again, they don't look you in the eye, or they pause before they say something, or they're just kind of looking a little uncomfortable, you can tell that if you listen to your intuition, great. They may not really be meaning 9 and 10. They probably mean 7 and 8. Everything was great. So that's when I think it's really important to dig deeper. And this takes a lot of courage, but that might mean saying to them, well, good. So tell me what's made your visit with us great. Because if they said great and they look at you and then they go, I'm not, let's see, then you know it actually was not great. Or, because when we have an experience at a restaurant or anywhere we go and we say it was great and we mean great, usually it's because we have a story to tell. We can say, oh my gosh, you won't believe what this tech did, or you won't believe your nurse is here. So it takes digging a little bit deeper. And at that point, again, I encourage you to pull up a chair and say, I really do want to hear how things are, your experience with this. Please, I'd love to have this conversation with you. And then that way you might discover some things you have to do some on service recovery on before they actually leave the hospital. And then regardless of what they say, of course, thank them for their honesty. And one of the questions I also often hear from both urban and rural hospitals is needing to get back more HCAHPS surveys. So one of the things that I teach leaders when they're doing their patient rounds is, of course, we have to be careful on the wording on this, but to even, especially when that patient says, oh, you know what, Nurse Susie was so nice. I really appreciated how kind she was to me and my wife. Then I think, let them know, you might be getting a survey when you get home. Please feel free to mention Susie in the survey, because I know that she would love to see her name, and we always like to recognize staff who are specifically named in the surveys. And so let the patient know, put that in the survey. Yes, thank you so much. Staff really like to hear that feedback. And then, of course, provide a way for the patient to reach you if they have other thoughts, or later if they decide, maybe I do want to talk more about this. And then immediately provide recognition to the staff member as quickly as possible. If something nice was said about a staff member, to go up to them and let them know your patient is bragging about you. Thank you so much for taking such good care of your patient and helping them with their healing. So a couple last takeaways. First of all, again, focus on 2 or 3 interventions. As I said earlier, the staff, the 2 that we have focused on for years has been around the 5 Ps and creating moments of kindness. The leadership also has their 2 or 3 strategies, which are doing staff rounds. So they round and they actually listen to the staff doing their 5P rounds so that they can give them feedback.